me the signal. When the road is rough and steep, fix your eyes upon Jesus. He alone has the power to keep. Fix your eyes upon Him. Jesus is the greatest friend, one on whom you can depend. He is faithful to the end. Fix your eyes upon Him.
because I haven't got any music.
Fantastic. Yeah. We are allowed to clap. So
I had to play that. Was it the year just before we moved here? Was it a local primary school where we were? And just at the start of the performance, one of the keys right in the middle of the piano broke. And it was like a D right here that was almost in everything, and I had to negotiate the whole concert without this note working. It was like a nightmare. Anyway.
That's brilliant. Thanks for that, Jonathan. We look forward to you hopefully giving us a couple more tunes this evening. So let's move on in your life then. And though you were brought up in a Christian family and churched from as long as you can remember by people like the Langtons, when do you feel you came to faith, and how did that happen? What was that for you?
So I think having been brought up in a Christian home, it's always one of those things to pinpoint the moment when I could say I wasn't a follower of Jesus this day and I was that day is very difficult for me. I used to think that was a bad thing. I used to actually want the really exciting testimony. You know, my life was full of sin and it was horrendous, and then suddenly I found Jesus and it was all wonderful. But actually, I think as I've got older, one thing I've really appreciated is that actually the testimony of God's faithfulness is a really powerful one. You know, and to have been brought up in a Christian family, taught about Jesus, and then carried on, is actually a real testament not only to the Lord's faithfulness, but to what my parents had taught me, and what you know their parents had taught them, sort of thing. But a key moment for me was when I was 18, and I was at Poynton Baptist. It was a Sunday evening service. Rob White, who was the minister there at the time, was preaching, and he did a call for baptism, and said, if there's anyone here who wants to be baptized, would you come to the front? Now, I'm not somebody who really likes doing that. It might surprise you, but I'm actually much more comfortable sat at the back than I am at the front. And so, for me, I was sort of sat there in my chair thinking, this won't be me. And it was almost like God put a huge spotlight saying, this is you. So by the time the call came, it was sort of like, I just had to go. I had to go and say yes.
This would be at what age?
18.
18 years old.
So it was the year where I was doing my A-levels. So it was a really, quite a transformational moment, I think, for me. And that was now my decision to follow Jesus. It wasn't an inherited faith. It was something that I had specifically made my own and made a definite decision from that point.
And do you feel, that although many people will have the same experience as you and have not had a blinding light or a life of great sinfulness, which suddenly changes, did anything change for you afterwards, or what for you was it just the next logical step?
I think it was more than a logical step. I think it was actually a profound experience of God at the time. So I think for me, it was, I could have decided to be baptized at any point earlier. I had friends who were going through baptism, but for me, it was like, no, this was the moment when I knew I had to make a decision. And I think that the years that followed, that decision actually, I think we'll talk a bit about experience later on, but I always say, if we experience God, I expect something to change. And for me, life changed after then.
Right. Well, we will come back to that. But for now, what's our third piece of music, Jonathan?
Okay, so I'm going to play a classical piece because probably from being in my mid-teens, I've always had a love of some of the classical composers and classical music. And this book, I'll get rid of that piece of paper. This book talked about my old house when I was a kid. It used to have cupboards that I don't know where stuff came from, but I found this in the attic. And it's a book of Haydn piano sonatas. And it says in the front of it, to Mr. Wood, with best wishes, Christmas 1908.
Wow.
So it's even older than you, Chris.
From George Frederick.
It's quite an old book. And I can remember finding this book and sitting down at the piano, probably about 14, 15, and playing some of this music. And it was so much more interesting than the boring rubbish I was playing for exams. And Haydn has always been one of those composers that I really like because it's always so full of life.
Right.
And you'll get all this really fast playing, and then suddenly you'll get a moment where it's like a bit of desolation or something that pulls on the heartstrings, and then it's off again. So I'm going to play a very quick movement. It's only about 1 minute 30
Great,
seconds.
fantastic, yeah, look forward to
And
it.
it's labelled as fast as possible, so I'll see what I can do. Cheer me on, yeah, I need to keep going because I wear out. Whoops, sorry, there's a page turn.
Fantastic. So I'm just going to ask you, because I noticed later we've got Bach coming up as well.
Yeah.
That, so from this, I'm assuming that you're very much of the classical composers, a classical fan rather than a fan of the Romantics, of the sort of big symphonies of Tchaikovsky, Beethoven, Schubert. Would that be right? And why would that be?
I suppose I would say I like all kinds of music. Sorry, am I having microphone problems again?
Third attempt.
The next one is that I shout. Here we go. Is that any better? That's not crackling.
It's good, yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, my sort of music, I suppose my appreciation of music would go right from 13th, 14th centuries right the way through all kinds of composers to modern day stuff to, you know, all kinds of contemporary music, jazz, all sorts.
But there's something about the form, is there? The structure
Yeah.
and the discipline almost of Haydn, Bach, and Mozart, perhaps.
I think there is something like that piece that just played that I find quite satisfying because it's
Yeah.
so condensed.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're learning a big, long 40-minute piece, you've got to keep your attention span for an awful long time. And perhaps I'm just too lazy to learn that kind of music. Perhaps that's the real reason.
Well, I think that, yeah.
Claire's nodding at me.
Right, well, let's, speaking of which, how did you and Claire meet?
Well, that's a really interesting one because me and Claire have always known of each other.
Of each other?
Of each other. So there is a story that Claire's
Was it Don't Play With That Jonathan Bramwell?
So, like I mentioned before, my mum and dad and Claire's grandparents were quite good friends. They were in the same church together, and so as families, there was always just sort of we've known of each other as families, and for quite a while growing up, we weren't at the same church or anything. But then I'm trying to think, when was it? We started going out in 1997, didn't we? 23 years ago, and it was at Hazelgrove Baptist Church where we were both part of the same music team. And I can remember that we started to play and to sing songs together, and Claire would come into church in the afternoon, and we'd start to arrive a little bit earlier than everybody else, and then a little bit earlier again, and then I can still remember her bringing like 2 Kit Kats with her, and things like this, and I think we both started to realise actually there was something more to this than just...
Wasn't just rehearsing.
It wasn't
for
just rehearsing,
sake.
yeah,
Okay.
and so,
Fair
yeah.
enough, fair enough, good. So, and then of that sort of time then, late 90s then,
Yeah.
you know, again, what had church that you spoke before of during the 80s and the sort of introduction of Graham Kendrick, and what would have been the change to the late 90s? What was new in church music?
So as you go into the 90s, you start to get quite a different style of writing that I think really has continued to this point in many ways. So some of the songs, I think we're going to listen to one in a moment that's a favourite of mine from this time, but a lot of songs from the Vineyard movement. So David Ruiz, Brian Dirksen, songs like Purify My Heart would have been that kind of time. Don't Let Your Love Grow Cold. Some of the early Delirious songs, Thank You for Saving Me. I think we sung that last week if you were here. And what you start to get is a broadening out of the way songs are written. They're a lot longer than they used to be. And the words are perhaps a little more expressive. So if you think back, if any of you were in the church in the early 80s, songs are quite short.
Majesty,
Worship is Majesty, or that first one we had tonight, When the Road is Rough and Steep. Yeah. They're a minute and a half. Now songs are getting to be 4 or 5 minutes long, and that allows. At this point, I was leading worship a lot, sung worship a lot. It allows you as a worship leader to be much more sort of expansive in the way you lead. You can keep a song going, if you like, for want of a better word, for 5-10 minutes.
And were they becoming more theological, more telling a story, or were they still like the 80s, just sort of one idea, Majesty or whatever it is?
I think what you start to get is songs that are perhaps a bit more of a theme, but quite often a very personalised theme. So, like Thank You for Saving Me, it's my story.
Right.
It's not particularly corporate a lot of the time, and the song we'll listen to in a minute is called I Will Worship. Okay. To me, it's a really good song, but it's about my relationship with God. So there isn't that sort of corporate element in some of it. Just while we're on this sort of period of time, just to talk about one experience, I have mentioned this before in preaching, but when I think it was probably the mid-90s, I was one evening was in a small group meeting, and I was leading worship on this terrible keyboard. I mean, it must have been this sort of size Yamaha keyboard. It was the least hyped group you could imagine. We were all sat around in a circle in somebody's lounge trying to sing. Now, if you've been in a small group that tries to sing, you'll know it's not always the easiest experience. But in the middle of this time of singing, of praising God, there was a lady in the room who really couldn't sing. And I mean, she was self-confessed non-singer. For about a minute, she suddenly started to sing in what I can only describe as an angelic voice. And it was as if the Spirit had fallen in that place for a short period of time. And at the end of it, we were all like, what has happened? So that verse that I read from Ephesians, where it talks about songs from the Spirit, I think sometimes we can be very cerebral as Christians and sort of want to say, well, that's a particular type of worship song. Whereas what I experienced that night was that actually sometimes the Spirit just falls on a congregation and inspires music to come deep out of the heart that actually is a God thing and is a God instance. I mean, I couldn't, as a musician, I couldn't have described what was going on. I couldn't have written it down. It was something that you could say was a God moment and a sort of an experience of the divine nature of God in that small house in Bramall, which was quite incredible.
Almost like singing in tongues, but really singing in tongues.
Yeah, it was, And I think that there's a phrase that I think, I can't remember who it is, who says that, somebody who's had an experience of God is never at the mercy of somebody who has an argument about God.
Yeah.
And for me, that was one of those moments that whenever I felt fed up in church life, whenever I've got fed up with playing yet another worship song, which those moments do happen, I think for all of us, those moments do happen. Quite often God will take me back to that moment and think, actually, there are times when I will show up and I will change you radically as you come into my presence.
Yeah, or as someone once said, God is a person, not an argument. And that's why the argumentative approach often doesn't work, does it? Okay, so take us to our fourth piece of music, Jonathan.
So this was this song I've just mentioned called I Will Worship, which is a song, you will probably all know it. We still sing it in church sometimes. It's one of those songs from the late 90s. So I've managed to find a video with some great late 90s outfits in it as well.
Yeah.
So let's have a listen to this. This is David Ruiz' song, I Will Worship.
But isn't it interesting just looking at that, not that I'm an expert, but you could almost date music by the clothes and the style, can't you?
Yeah, you can.
Sometimes on a Saturday night, I'm just sat there looking for something to do. I can't remember what channel it is. There's some channel, and they show Top of the Pops from the 70s or the 60s or the 80s, and it's really interesting. The music was obviously interesting, but also the fact that you got people in like suits and ties, just sort of very sort of swaying around, and it's just incredible. Just that could be a PhD, Jonathan.
It could, yeah.
Anyway, yeah. Did you want to say anything more about that, or?
Well, I just think, if you think how far the music has gone from When the Road is Rough and Steep to that.
Yeah.
Whether it's better or worse is a totally subjective thing, but just the change in style and the change in what the songs are about is quite remarkable in a 20-year period, really.
Yeah, very much so. So you were a musician and a music teacher,
Yeah.
and you were a director of music at a large church. Just tell us about that. Briefly.
So this probably. So Claire and I got married in 2000. We had Timothy in 2005. And shortly afterwards, I think we both started to sense that God was calling me into some kind of full-time ministry. Yeah. It was quite a slow sort of process, I think, that call to ministry. And I started preaching. That was pretty horrendous, I think, to start with, and slowly got a bit better. And then I remember going to talk to our minister at the time and saying, we're sensing this call to ministry. And he said, well, if God's calling you, God will keep calling you. But is there anything else you need to do first? So I think we both said we'd always wanted to explore what it would be like serving God full-time in a church in a music role. So there was this job advertised in a big Anglican church down in Bristol, Christ Church in Clifton. So I sent off this application thinking I probably won't hear anything back from them. Anyway, got an interview and then got offered the job, which was a bit of a shock. But anyway, we decided to go, and we're down there for a few years, and it was really quite an interesting experience in many ways.
And then you did feel God still calling you. So when did you start training, and where did you train, and then how would you describe the music at that time?
So when did I start training? I'm trying to think now. 2009, would it?
Around then.
Around then, 2008, 2009. You forget, don't you, when you thinking back. So so from Bristol, I went to Northern Baptist College, which is over in Manchester, Luther King House, and did 3 years, did a master's there alongside Baptist ministry training, and did a sort of minister's placement at Stockport Baptist Church.
Right. And had you written any songs by this time?
Yeah, so, I'd been writing songs since I was 18. Actually, I looked up, the first song that I ever wrote was on Psalm 63, which is, God, you are my God, earnestly I seek you, I thirst for you, my whole being longs for you, in a dry and parched land where there is no water. Absolutely beautiful words, but sadly the song that I wrote, there is no way I would sing it for you now. It was this garbled sort of song that went so quickly through the words, you hadn't got time to catch your breath. But over the years, I've written, quite a bit. Me and Claire write sometimes together, and Claire always tells me off for fitting too many words to musical lines, so I still have to learn to do that better.
Do we have an example tonight?
We do. So this was one that we sung here, actually. I think we wrote, was it 3 years ago? For Christmas, that if you're in the choir, you may know it. So it's Wonderful Counselor.
Mighty
Great. And if you enjoyed that, I'm sure CDs are still available. Exit via the gift shop. Gift shop is there. But you had another piece of music for us, actually, didn't you?
I do.
At this point of... so why have you chosen this piece, then?
So this is a piece of Bach, and this goes back to our time in Bristol, where the church in Christchurch there was a really diverse church at the point we were there, sort of musically. So we had Sunday morning was lively worship like we would have here. Sunday night was effectively a student congregation. We'd have about 600 people there. Great big band, really lively. But the church also had a classical music side to it. So there was a choir and an orchestra that would play at Christmas and Easter and other things. And this bit of Bach's Christmas oratorio was something we did one Christmas. So feel Christmassy for a minute.
Yeah.
Was will uns Welt entzündet was will der Hölle schrecken was will uns Welt entzündet
That last bit of that was actually something we did for a carol service.
Right.
So the carol services in Bristol, we did back-to-back carol services for the 4 Sundays before Christmas. So it was quite a tiring experience.
And again, your love of Baroque,
Yeah.
the fanfares and the rhythm and of that era, right?
And there was somebody said about Bach that Bach was better at music than any human being has been at anything. Which I think is probably quite true, actually. If you look at, he was incredibly, but also
as well.
prolific, but also a man of incredible faith.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
So, a very deeply committed Christian who would write "Glory to God" at the bottom of everything he wrote.
His father was church organist, and he may have been at some point. So,
Yeah.
okay. Right, so let's move on. Time's pressing on. Let's just sort of more general question. Other churches that you've either worked at or experience of, and we're now into sort of 2010 and beyond.
Yeah.
What are the styles of church music, worship music, could you describe to us?
It's interesting. I think one thing that we've noticed is whatever churches we've sort of ministered in, is each church has have songs that seem to particularly relate to that church.
Right.
So the church where we were before we came here was in Epworth in North Lincolnshire. And there was a songwriter called Godfrey Birtill. I don't know if anyone's come across him. And they loved his songs, absolutely loved them. So we were always doing these Godfrey Birtill songs that I've never heard done anywhere else. And then here, there are songs that I think resonate with our church here. So I know if My Lighthouse is on the list, or Praise the Name on a Sunday, that people will really get into those songs and want to praise and worship through them. And yet there are other songs that we might do here that people look at them and say, this doesn't really resonate with us. And it's just it's a fascinating thing about context and about culture and about, shared things that churches have together. And I think it's the same wherever you go. I'm sure, churches you've been in before, they would have had their favourites. And
you have your favourite, and then you go to another church and you wonder why nobody's singing it.
Yeah.
Try and slide it in somehow. But then, more just opening it out a bit, because we kind of touched on this at the start, and you talked about the verse from Ephesians about why do we actually sing. So let me just show, I mean, I'm sure you found this as well. So I remember somebody saying to me here, just before lockdown, just after a Sunday morning, and it's not unique. He said, oh, I've had a really good sing now, a really good sing, so I'm set up for the week. Mm-hmm. So to what extent is it a physical, emotive event that causes an adrenaline rush or cortisone or whatever it is? And to what extent is it for us as a physical event almost, and to what extent is it for God? Why? Again, I'm asking you the same question again. Why do we sing? And can you help us with, what are we doing when we sing?
I think that's a really, really fascinating question, isn't it? And again, there are multi-layers to it. And I think going back to that verse in Ephesians, there is the singing to one another, there is the upward singing to God, and there is the effect that it has on us as well. Yeah. And there is also there's that verse in James where it says, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. And I think for me, that's always been a really important verse when I'm either leading worship or being led in sung worship, that it's that conscious decision and space for us to draw near. And there is something about music, I think, that stirs us in a way that other things just don't seem to. And it's universal, isn't it? Every culture in the world has its own music, has its own soundtrack. And I think, it's a gift from God. It's something he wants us to use. It's something that is biblically based. And I think it's something that when that is done to God, it can be a really moving thing. There is a bit of caution I would put in there, though, is that you can have a musical experience that isn't God-centered. Right. And I'm sure most of us will have been to, it doesn't matter what kind of music you're into, if you've been to Glastonbury, say, or something like that, or you've been to something at the proms, or whatever type of music you're into, you can be incredibly moved by the event, but that doesn't mean it's a God event. Nice. And there can be sometimes that huge adrenaline rush that comes with playing, or singing, or being part of a big crowd. And I think sometimes we have to be very careful that we don't mix those two up.
But what's wrong with
nothing's wrong with
an adrenaline rush in church? You love a song, you love him. Is that a good or a bad thing, or should we be seeking more than that?
I think I would want to ask the question of, well, if we're having experiences of God in church, in my own life, I would want to see something changing. Yeah. From that. I think that experience I shared a bit earlier on, right, of being in that room where there was that, that sudden song of the Spirit. It really changed how I then believed, what I believed, right, how I acted, what I saw singing could be. Right. If we're just singing songs and, we think, oh, that was lovely, wasn't that, nice, and then we go and we're not changed, I would want to say, well, are we actually encountering God there? Or are we just having a good sing-song? Not that there's anything wrong with that.
No. But what you're saying is there has to be more than.
There has to be more.
Just, that was a great song.
Yeah.
And I feel good about it.
Yeah.
Which is good, but there has to be something. It's like I don't know if it ever actually happened, but there was a story of the sign on the church as you went out, rather than you came in, that said, the worship is over, let the service begin. That there has to be some impact of what we do here. Yeah. It can't just be that we feel really good about it, even though there's nothing wrong with that. Or it's just a drug, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think there is something as well as you go to those last chapters of Revelation, and there's all those amazing songs of praise before the throne of God. That actually, when we sing, when we raise our voices, we are joining in with that. So if it is an end of time event when we sing as well. We're joining with the angelic choirs of heaven, if you like, and I think there is something really profound about doing that as well. So I think it's multi-layered, and
right. So do you think, in that sense, that music can be a sacrament? You just want to explain what a sacrament is, perhaps?
So a sacrament would be a means of grace, a way by which God ministers to us. Now, depending on how high church you are, depends on quite how you define that. But
we have communion.
We would have
and
communion,
baptism, don't we? As sacraments.
Those would be the ways of means that God speaks. I think in a number of churches it can become sacramental, in the sense that it can be, we expect to encounter God during the singing, and we expect God to speak to us. I'm not sure quite what my answer to whether that is the right way of looking at singing is, but I think it has become that. And there's quite a lot of people writing about that at the moment, and sort of just asking that question.
Is that the subject of your PhD?
It could be.
Had the word sacramental in it.
It could be.
So you could tell us more in a few years, perhaps. Okay, great. No, thanks for that. So let's do another piece of music and tell us what you've chosen and why you've chosen it.
Okay, so I thought I would stick a more traditional hymn in as one of the the pieces, because I think it's great to sing new songs. You know, I think there is that biblical command, isn't there? Sing a new song to the Lord. You know, don't become just people of ritual and doing the same things over and over again. But there is also an awful lot to be learned from the wisdom and the words and the inspiration of years that have gone before us. So I've just picked a hymn. It's a slightly different version of it, but it's one of my favourites, which is I Will Sing the Wondrous Story, because it tells a story, and it's one of these great storytelling hymns. So it's from one of the Welsh hymns, I Will Sing the Wondrous Story.
I will sing the wondrous story of the Christ who died for me, how he left the realms of glory for the cross of Calvary. Yes, I'll sing the wondrous story of the Christ who died for me. Sing it with the saints in glory, gathered by the crystal sea. I was lost, but Jesus found me, found the sheep that went astray, raised me up and gently led me back into the narrow way. Yes, I'll sing the wondrous story of the Christ who died for me. Sing it with the saints in glory, gathered by...
That hymn.
Yeah.
I'm sure you do as well. I'm sure many of us do, and yearn for the day when we can sing the wondrous story in here again. But do you want to just tell us, what then essentially is the difference between a traditional hymn like that and a modern worship song?
So I think if you go to, if you like, traditional models of traditional hymns, which I'm not exactly sure that's the best traditional model of a traditional hymn because it's a storytelling one, but you get a lot of hymns that will take an idea and then through poetry will sort of muse on it, if you like, and expand it a little bit, and it will go through in a logical kind of order. Whereas a worship song generally is written quite differently. So whereas hymns are written in 4-part harmony, often for choirs to sing, a worship song is written really with the drummer in mind and with what's called a backbeat, which is like a dum-dum, chum-dum kind of feel underneath it. Lyrically, what you also get is far more worship songs are more to do with an expression of my worship, our worship to God, rather than necessarily being a poetic journey. There are exceptions, so you get some modern writers, somebody like Stuart Townend or the Gettys, who, in Christ alone, the power of the cross, some of these modern hymns, which may have the musical style of a worship song, but are actually written in a sort of more older style.
So when you're saying that hymns have a kind of a structure and a logical progression, like a story or a journey or something, so whereas songs are more experiential, that's the phrase you used, isn't it? More just gazing at God, is that a way of looking at it? Or?
Yeah, quite often. More, I suppose, one thing that I often value in worship songs is they are very relational, and it's both a positive and it can be a negative, is that they take something of the distance between us and God that hymns can sometimes create. But that can also be a downside if God becomes like too familiar almost, and,
Yeah. Someone once said it's like the hymn is a journey. It's often a theological journey, but the worship song is you just stop on the journey and gaze at the view. And there's no need to rush on, is there? Just enjoy the view. We used to, with the repetition of songs, which seems to be, there's some repetition now where I just remember a chap at our old church in St Edmunds who was a bit grumpy about it and said, because he used to repeat Majesty about 8 times or something. He said, if God hasn't heard it the second time, he's not going to hear it the 8th time. So that was that. But wasn't into it. He was into hymns.
He was into hymns.
Yeah. Okay, and then finally then, coming to, how did you receive your call to Lynn Baptist Church? How did that happen, and when did that happen?
So we're going back 5 years, or just over 5 years now. And we were in Epworth, which was it was a good church. It was a good place to be, but we really started to sense that God was saying, don't settle where you are.
Yeah.
And to explore. And the way that Baptist ministers sort of get called is this odd thing called the settlement process, where you get a list of churches to look at that are available. It's a bit like a dating agency, but with churches and ministers. And you get this list, and it suddenly popped out. Oh, I remember saying to Claire, Lynn Baptist is on the list. And we knew Chris Newton a little bit because he'd been at Hazel Grove and used to come back and preach there. And so I think, Claire, you'd been in the manse, hadn't you, at Chris's ordination? I don't know when that was. And so there was some kind of background knowledge, and we just went from there, really. And it was just like God confirmed it each step of the way from there.
Oh, that was 2015.
2015,
yeah. I just have a little anecdote of, because you mentioned 1997 before, right? And we think that the first time we met Jonathan and Claire was probably 97 or 98. She probably just started going out, right? Which I hadn't realised. They came on a church weekend. We were at Bramwell Baptist Church, and you guys did the music. And they were a fantastic, great-looking young couple, yeah? Claire still is, of course, right? but then, fast forward 20 years, because I hadn't seen Jonathan and Claire for 20 years, right? And I thought, there's this position potentially at Lynn Baptist Church. Go and see Jonathan Bramwell. So 2017, 20 years later, I just had this I knocked on your door. And sometimes I have just these insane ideas. I don't know where they come from, right? But he opened it, and in my head, I just had this voice saying, this man looks like Jonathan Bramwell without hair on. What's he done with the Jonathan Bramwell with hair on? It's like, is he locked in the cellar or something? It felt like about half a minute, but it was probably a second. But it's just like, you see people decades later.
I know, yeah.
And some things are the same, but some things aren't. Anyway.
The Lord gives and the Lord takes.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. So Lynn Baptist Church, right? How would you summarize our worship music here? And how is it different to anything else?
We're really blessed here, I think, with some really great musicians. We've got a number of professional musicians, and then some, all kinds of different types of music. In terms of I suppose it's fairly similar to where we were in Hazel Grove, isn't it, in many ways, which was before we went down to Bristol, where I was sort of part-time music director for a while, in the sense that I think we have quite a nice balance of realness. We're not so polished that it's like a performance, but we have that kind of level of musicality that means that it doesn't fall apart and go wrong every week either. Right. So, yeah.
But if it's a key word there, performance, because it can be, I'm not saying any particular church, but it can become a performance. Yeah. And so, what's your views on the consumerization or the consumer nature of worship music in church? Perhaps, do you feel that that's...
Well, I think it's certainly something that has happened. I think if you look at the CCLI, which is the Christian Copyright Licensing Information, about which songs are the most sung in churches across the UK. And I'm not going to comment on the theology of any of them, but there are two main places they come from. One is Hillsongs, right, which is Australian, and the other is Bethel, which is in California. Right. And it was really interesting when I was in Romania last summer, and the autumn before, visiting Adrian and going to see all these different churches. There was one particular evening we went out to this church, literally in the middle of Transylvania, in the middle of nowhere. We drove 40 minutes down a pothole that had a bit of road attached to it. And we eventually got to this church, and we went in, and there was this building about this sort of size with all the same kind of stuff, keyboards, drums, set up at the front. There was a family there who seemed to have about 12 children who were all brilliant musicians. And the music was outstanding, absolutely brilliant. The way they led was great. What were they singing? Hillsongs and Bethel. And it just struck me, where is the organic music that is coming from our communities to worship God with? Where is the voice of the congregations that we're part of? And I think that's a challenge for us here. You know, we do have people who write, we have people who are poets, we have people who are artists, we have people who are songwriters. How about using some of our own expressions to actually worship God here with what God is doing here? Great what God's doing in other places, but what about what God is doing here?
I mean, it's almost like the monopolization of technology by Google and Apple or something. There's two companies in the world, and everybody has a phone from one of them, and what you're saying is the worldwide church is singing songs from California and Australia, where 99% of the worldwide church have never been to Australia or California, right?
There's a really interesting book by a bloke called John Drain that's called The McDonaldization of the Church.
Right.
Which talks about how a lot of the church has become really uniform across the world. And, you know, you get your equivalent of the Big Mac wherever you go. I think it's,
So we'll work out what songs comprise a Big Mac in a minute. Yeah, interesting. And so it's commercialization and the consumer nature, isn't it? That, you know, we can criticize that, we can critique that, but also we consume that, don't we, as consumers? And you will know, just made me think of a quote of Glenn Marshall, who was, and I know Glenn Marshall, who was a principal at Northern Baptist College. I remember him saying that consumerization isn't simply that we all go to the shops. The consumerization is where we believe that we have the choice over everything. So I choose where to live, or where my kids go to school. I choose what church to go to. I choose what they sing. I choose how my kids are taught. I choose the length of the sermon. If it's not right, I'll shop around and go somewhere else. And that is a prevalent, that is nature. Society is more and more seeing that, isn't it? Where we see, on the one hand, the commercialization of, you know, there's two places in the world where that pump out songs, but on the other hand, we as consumers are contributing to that in our consumer nature, aren't we? Did you agree with that? What do you think about that?
I think there's two things there. I mean, I think we will have a Hillsong song in a minute, one that I think is a really, really well-written worship song. The problem is some of these places do it really, really well.
Yeah.
And so they have really skilled songwriters who produce really high-quality material.
But isn't that like, and I'm not a fan or anything, but X Factor they produce bands.
Yeah.
They pick out, you know, you no longer get kids in the garage. Well, I don't know, but you don't seem to get kids in the garage who make it, who just come together because they're mates. It's all produced.
Well, I think we live in a world where there is an expectation of certain levels of production, isn't there? And I don't know if you've ever listened to, if you have like worship music that goes back a number of years, sometimes I will just stick something on from like 20 years ago, and it sounds really rough compared to the stuff we would buy now. Just the production level isn't the same.
Yeah. And you know, music has a way of, as we said earlier, of reaching us very deeply.
Yeah.
But I guess what we're saying is, to some extent, some organisations and people who are very clever can almost make that into a formula or formulise that to some extent. Is that fair? And where's God then? If you know, if we've got a formula, if these two places in the world have a formula for pumping out music that we love, is God still in that? So that
I mean, you could, if you applied that argument, you could say then, well, why do we listen to the music of Bach? Because he was so good at writing.
Yeah, you could
I wouldn't want to be disparaging at all about the gifts and the way that other churches do things. But I think what it does do is pose the question of what are we doing? You know, perhaps not just our church, but what are we doing locally? You know, it was great to do that Warrington Blessing, to have all the churches in Warrington clubbing together to do something. But why aren't we having songwriting workshops locally? Why aren't we learning to do these things in our context? So rather than, it's very easy to point the finger and say this and this and this is wrong, but how do we then make that better in our context?
At least being aware of it to start with.
Yeah.
I've just realised there's two more pieces of music, not one. So what's the seventh piece of music?
The seventh piece of music, I think it's always interesting how every generation of Christians think that their music is the best. I don't know if you've noticed that. So what I thought I would just play a clip of is the earliest Christian hymn that we know. So this goes back to the 3rd century. It's a hymn called Hail Gladdening Light, and it was written to give thanks to God at the coming of the evening while you light the lamp. So perhaps just 30 seconds of it, because it's a bit of an unfamiliar sound, but just have a listen so you can get the idea.
No.
that's the earliest Christian hymn that
That's
we
the
know
earliest
of.
one that we know of. And you get that, did you notice you got that, oh, coming underneath?
Yeah, a droning.
That is called the I song, which is apparently significant of the Trinity and the continual life of God
Wow.
that continues under every single hymn that's written over that period.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, thanks for that. So just finally then, because you've helped us understand the power of music to reach us in ways that go beyond words, beyond reading, writing, perhaps beyond imagery. And you've also explained to us also the fact that we sing to God, but we also sing for ourselves, and we sing to each other. So right now, we're in lockdown, or not lockdown, but we are to some extent locked down, that we can't sing, we can't meet in the ways. How can we worship?
So, I mean, I know, was it 3 weeks ago when me and Claire were leading one of these evenings, and Claire was singing, and I had to sit there in silence, not being able to join in. I usually would join in when Claire's singing and do bits of harmony and things. That is incredibly difficult. It's really difficult. It's really frustrating. And there is something that just feels intrinsically wrong about it. So there's part of me wants to say, well, it is wrong, and it's okay that it feels wrong, because God never made us not to sing. You know, we will end up singing in eternity, and that's the pictures of the New Jerusalem that we have in Revelation. So I think it's okay to sit here and think, actually, that feels pretty rubbish that I can't sing. But actually what that doesn't do is change God. You know, and God is still the same, even though we are currently not singing to keep one another safe. So I think the things I try and do is think, well, how can I use these words to reflect on God's nature? Can I hum quietly? What other biblical expressions of worship can we do? Can we kneel? Can we raise our hands? Bow? Lie on the floor? Whatever it is. These are all things we find people doing in the Bible that actually we don't do a lot of. Sometimes we're a bit constrained with space, perhaps, to do some of those things. But it's not our culture. Whereas we do a lot of singing. So I think for me it's about exploring other ways, other ways of worshiping.
So use the fact that we can't sing to think, well, how can I worship?
Yeah.
And what other ways are there that perhaps we haven't explored either as a church or as individuals? And then finally, Jonathan, just lastly, if you had a single hope for sung worship as we go through the 2020s, what would that be? How would you like to see church worship develop in the next decade?
So I think there would be two things for me. One would be that organic sense of worship music growing up from the places in which people are. So not just, yes, let's keep some of the slick songs, let's not lose some of that. But, wouldn't it be great to have some of our young people writing praise songs to God that then we can join in with, and those kind of things. So I think a more earthy approach in that kind of way of sort of ground level up. I think the other would go back to less about me when I come and worship, and more about a real desire to encounter God. I think it's far too easy, and I do it, I'm sure we all do it. You go to church and you don't like the songs, and you sit there with a grumpy face because you don't like what you're singing. Rather than saying, actually, how can God meet me here? How can I make myself available to God? And how can we encounter God in this place? So I think for me, it will be about not being too worried about the music and getting back to seeking after the presence of God, who draws near to us as we draw near to him.
Brilliant, thank you. And your last piece of music?
So my last piece of music is, this was a song that I think was written last summer. So last summer I was on sabbatical, and I think we listened to this round and round and round and round, driving around Wales. And it's a song then, I know we started to sing in church last September. So it's a Hillsong song, it's called King of Kings. And for me, it's a really amazing blend of the traditional hymn, a storytelling, and a worship song. Okay. Because it has a chorus that is just, it's about praising God, whereas the other stuff tells a bit of a story. Okay. So we probably haven't got time to do all of it, but let's have the first bit.
Yeah.
Not that one. Although that is a lovely view.
In the darkness throne of endless glory to a cradle in the dirt. Praise the Father, praise the Son, praise the Spirit, three in one. God of glory, majesty, praise forever to the King of Kings. To reveal the kingdom coming and to reconcile the lost, to redeem the whole creation. You did not.
Favourite here,
Yeah,
and will always be.
yeah.
So, I'm sorry we've gone on a bit, I lost track of how many songs we'd had, but we don't want to lose the last bit, which is, so Jonathan, on your desert island where we've cast you away to, in the middle of Cheshire somewhere, what book would you like to take with you? You've got the Bible, any translation you require.
Okay.
You've got Shakespeare. Well, you can always use it as fire,
Or
or
use it
set
as
fire
fire,
to
yeah.
it or something. So what would you take?
Can I be a bit of a kid and take the Narnia books with me?
Oh, God, we'll let you have that.
Yeah.
Now, the last question is, Jonathan has to choose one luxury item to take with him. Now, I've been doing some research around the church and just asking people, what would Jonathan Bramwell really like to take with him? We've had some good suggestions. I think Carol, you suggested a box of matches, which was good. Several people, relating to 1 Corinthians, I'm sure, have talked about head coverings. I don't, that just seems to be a repeating
yeah.
thing. But Anne, where are you, Anne? Where's Anne? Right. Anne came up with a brilliant one, though, which was, why don't we get you a handkerchief, which is knotted in 4 corners, right? But then you can take it off, put it around your face, so the wildlife on the island doesn't get COVID-19.
Brilliant.
That's pretty clever.
That's it.
And within budget. Then Ralph. Where are you, Ralph? Yeah, Ralph had several emails from Ralph, one after another. I won't go through all of them. But the last one was interesting. He says, because Jonathan has a fascination of rivers,
Yeah.
apparently, why don't we get him a hydroelectric power generator? It should be very useful, or at least a book to create your own hydroelectric generator. And there's a link here, so you can get a book to create your
Can
own
you send me that? That'd be great.
We have to send you to a desert island, then,
Oh,
in that case, right. And Sam, where's Sam? Sorry a minute. Has suggested a couple of things, but the one I liked was Sam suggested Ladybird book of Donald Trump. That genuinely would be good to see, wouldn't it? Yeah.
It might become a bit wearing.
I'm wearing, but and then Alison, I thought her suggestion was good. She said, if Jonathan was going on a desert island, was a luxury item, why wouldn't he take the whole Lynn Baptist Church congregation?
Yeah.
Be honest. I think you let off because that would not be an inanimate.
That would no, that's not. Well,
But did you see a momentary look of panic there, just for a second? Yeah, just for a second, right? Yeah. No, thank you, Jonathan. It's been great, and I think people have found it very engaging to find out a little bit about you, and also a little bit more about church music and worship music and why we do what we do. It's been really good. Let's give Jonathan a round of applause, please.
do I get to pick my luxury
Oh,
item?
sorry. Finally, sorry, you do get to pick
Do
your
you get to
luxury
pick one?
item, so go for it.
Well, I've talked about Bach already tonight, and Bach had a massively strong faith, but he had a love of something else as well. And he actually wrote a piece of music to celebrate it, and it's coffee. There is a coffee cantata by Bach.
Coffee canton.
Yeah, so I would take with me a coffee machine to make a really good supply
Very good,
of coffee.
very good idea. I might do the same.
Yeah.
If I had to join you, I'd be okay with that. Thank you, everyone, here for coming tonight. Thank you if you joined on the live stream. And just a special thanks that we wouldn't be able to do these evenings without our stewards. There's a lot of cleaning and preparation and cleaning up afterwards. And, of course, in the pulpit, also known as the AV station, Mims and Neil, and we've had Will and Tim and other people. Thank you all as well. So So let me just pray as we finish. Heavenly Father, we thank you, Lord, for the gift of music and the power of music, and that music delights you. Thank you that it brings delight to our souls. And Lord, sometimes right now, we sometimes feel we're in a parched and dry land. So help us, Father, in this time, in these places, to find those ways of worship, those new ways of worship, Lord, that some parts of us can sing a new song, even if it's not with our voice. Help us, Lord, to take what you give us through your word, Lord, and to find those ways to worship you in this time. And we look forward, Lord, to that day, which will come, Lord, when we can gather back to here and sing praises to your name. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Okay, thanks for coming tonight. As you leave, could you just make